Hey, welcome back everybody. So, what are we talking about today? Well, today we're talking about the Heckscher-Ohlin model. What's the Heckscher-Ohlin model, you say? Well, it's a model that predicts patterns of trade. Super exciting. Alright. Okay, so today we're talking about the Heckscher-Ohlin model. This is the beginning of lecture 3 for Econ 351. Now, the Heckscher-Ohlin model is often just abbreviated to HO model. Sometimes people don't even say what model they're using, and they're using a Heckscher-Ohlin model. For a long time, the Ricardian model is the basic too, but for a long time, for pretty much the 20th century, this was the model. And really all that it is a somewhat more sophisticated Ricardian model. Assumptions are somewhat different, but let's just hop into it. It's sometimes even referred to as the standard model. So if you hear somebody say that, well, this is a standard international trade model, okay, they're referring to a Heckscher-Ohlin model. So it is the basis for, in some way, shape, or form, for most policy discussions on international trade. Okay. So Heckscher-Ohlin models originally developed back in the 1930s by Heckscher and Ohlin. I can remember Ohlin's first name was Bertie because that's easy to remember, Bertie Ohlin. But I can't remember Heckscher's first name off the top of my head. It says here, it's a modern classic. You pick up any textbook on international trade theory, and for sure it's in there. So for sure they've got Ricardo, and for sure they've got Heckscher-Ohlin. Without exception, you'll never find it absent, because again, it's sort of the standard. So if you're going to be fluent in discussing international trade, you have to be fluent in this model. And I use the word fluent with purpose. You should know it as well as you know how to construct the next sentence you're going to say. That is, your brain doesn't even really have to think about it. Okay, so on this slide I wanted to review the lessons that we've learned from these models so far, as well as cover the lesson that we'll learn in this model. Okay, so the Ricardian model, all nations can benefit from trade, even if they don't have an absolute advantage. Specific factor model, some segments of society benefit from trade while others do not. Okay. However, the total benefit from trade still exceeds total losses, right? In this specific factor model, we saw this sort of, if you could move around and take advantage of trade, then you're going to be a lot better off. Whereas if you were stuck in an industry or type of production that was now subject to imported goods and services, and unable to move away from there, that it's very likely you were going to lose from trade. In the HO model, what we're showing is that factor endowments impact the pattern of trade, right? So the sort of real stuff you have impacts the pattern of trade, and that nations tend to, or the HO model predicts that nations should tend to export in areas where they have relatively large factor type endowments. So for example, a lot of capital that relative to other nations, that nation should export goods that are capital intensive. All right. And then, did I say import or export? Anyway, let me just say it again. In the HO model, if you're a nation that has a relatively large capital endowment of capital, meaning you have a lot of physical and financial capital, that you should export goods or services that are intensive in that area. All right, we'll talk a little more about that as we go through the presentation. So recall that in the Ricardian model, the gains from trade as well as the basis for trade derive from differences in labor productivity, right? So if nations specialized in areas where they had relative productivity advantages, then they would both be able to benefit from trade. And if they specialized in an area where they had relative productivity advantages, Those would also be the areas that they have the lowest opportunity cost, therefore the comparative advantage, therefore benefit from trade. Okay. The HO model explains comparative advantage from a different way, right? So, whereas Ricardo is comparative advantage based upon relative productivities, okay, HO is based upon relative factor endowments. In other words, how much land, labor, and capital a nation has. Okay. So the assumptions of the Heckscher-Ohlin model: 2 nations, 2 factors, 2 goods. These are also sometimes called, so I've mentioned a lot of names, right? Heckscher-Ohlin, HO, standard model. They're also sometimes called 2 by 2 by 2 models, right? So if somebody says 2 by 2 by 2 trade model, they're talking a Heckscher-Ohlin model. All right. We're going to assume that both factors can move between industries. So it's not like the factor-specific model, now where they can move back and forth, but that they exhibit diminishing returns, and there is somewhat, as a consequence, there is somewhat limited substitutability, right? So the substitutability is not constant across different industries. So people can, go from this to that, but there may be costs associated with doing so. We're going to assume that one of those 2 industries that's producing one of the 2 goods, right, is labor intensive and one is capital intensive. Now, if the 2 industries exhibit different production functions, then that has to be the case. So we could summarize that assumption down to the 2 industries producing the 2 goods exhibit 2 different production functions, which would basically have to be the case if the 2 different goods are different. And so we could even further collapse that down into 2 goods, but we need to understand everything that's implied in that. 2 nations have different factor endowments, right? So it's an allocation of labor. Capital is not the same in the 2 countries, right? So one has a relatively large amount of labor and one has a relatively large amount of capital. And then, small corresponds, right? Goods and services can move between the nations. So we can trade in goods and services, but factors of production and does not, right? So the next models we're going to do after this are going to start saying, well, what if the factors of production start moving around between the nations? Then Heckscher-Ohlin doesn't quite get it, right? You've got another layer of problem that you've got to solve. But if we assume that sort of people and physical capital and stuff like that is sort of stuck in a place, but that goods and services can move freely, then we've sort of got a Heckscher-Ohlin style situation. We're going to also assume that technology and information can flow between 2 nations. So, for example, if a production process comes into existence in nation A, it can be, and in fact will be, replicated in nation B, right? So let's say nation A develops some new farming technique or something like this that increases crop yields. Heckscher-Ohlin model assumes that technology can and will move in relatively short order over to the other nation as well. So that sort of Ricardian style productivity advantages really can't occur over any significant length of time, because those productivity advantages themselves will be exported. Okay, so that's important to understand. Then finally, we're going to assume that tastes and preferences in general are the same in both nations. So, when we talk about our indifference curves and things like that, it doesn't matter whether it's nation A or nation B. Okay. So what we've done on this slide and this is lifted straight from an older edition of your text, but the one in your text in this chapter is the same. So you should be following along with this in your own set of PowerPoint slides, but if you want to also open the book too, it may be helpful to work through this that way. But so we have 2 PPFs here for 2 different nations, right? And the PPFs are visibly different. And why are they visibly different? They are visibly different as a result of the assumptions that we've made. So, for example, we've assumed that in this case, in the home country, both can make computers and shoes. I know these the two goods are always so hokey, right? So they can make computers and shoes. All right. Implicit within this layout, right? I'm sure it's in the text made explicit, but implicit within this is that computers are sort of capital intensive, right? So we're going to use a lot more capital to make computers than when compared to shoes. And conversely, shoes are by default labor intensive. So we're going to use more labor relative to capital in shoe production. So the design of these, the construction of these PPFs, for the home country then implies that the home country is relatively well endowed in terms of capital, and the foreign country is relatively well endowed in terms of labor. That is to say, the home country has a bunch of capital relative to labor, and the foreign country has a bunch of labor relative to capital. It does not speak in absolute terms. It's all relative. So, for example, the home country may have more of both, right? But, maybe they have treble the capital and only double the labor. Okay, that will work just fine in a Heckscher-Ohlin model. It's relative, right? So that ratio, treble the capital, would be, let's say there's, 50 or whatever in the First Nation capital is 150, right? Okay, yeah, you can do that math. All right, the rest of what we have here is we have some indifference curves that have been sketched in. These are labeled U and U star for home and foreign, respectively. And the tangency of those indifference curves, which remember just reflects, they're just a graphical representation of tastes and preferences. The fact that these are convex to the origin tells us that we're assuming that these consumers in both nations sort of like an even mix of shoes. They like to have computers, but they like to be wearing shoes when they're using them. Okay. Or when they're wearing shoes, they like to be able to carry their computer around. I don't know. Okay, well, they like a mix of both. They don't like all of one, or they don't like all of the other. They want a mix, right? That's where you get the convexity, those functions. So the tangency of those indifference curves and the production relationship, the PPF, just gives us the preferred mix of shoes and computers that these societies would like produced, right? Okay, so those tangencies are marked by A and A star respectively for the home and the foreign nation. Okay, again, very similar to both the previous models. Now, because those are the preferences, right? A and A star, right? At that point, on both the PPF and the tangency, on the indifference curves, there is a implied trade-off in production. In other words, I'm giving up so much of shoes to get so many more computers, right? There's an opportunity cost in real terms. Okay, and that opportunity cost gives you the price ratio. Why? Okay, because that's just what people are willing to give up of one to get the other. It's like, think of this as like hours of work and then like stuff you want, right? So, like how many hours are you going to go to work to get the stuff you want, right? So there's a trade-off there, right? And whatever that ratio is, hours to work to stuff you want, because you could like get more stuff if you work longer, right? So, or get less stuff if you work less. So there's a trade-off. Okay, so what's that trade-off between those two things? Well, that's essentially the price that you're willing to supply labor at, right? For sure, and it's the quantity of labor you're willing to supply. All right, so those tangencies between production and indifference curves is simply a reflection of what society is willing to give up to get more of the other. In other words, relative prices. Okay, so we have two relative prices here. You'll notice that they're different. The home countries is notably flatter than the foreign countries, or to put it another way, the price of shoes in the home country relative to computers is high when compared to the foreign country. Now you're thinking like, geez, that's a lot of compares. Go back and watch it again. Okay, I'll do it again, even here, so you get it 3 times, right? You go back, list once, go back 2, and then again, 3rd time. Okay, so in the home country, every time I give up a computer, I get fewer shoes in the home country when compared to foreign. That is to say, in the home country, the price of shoes is relatively higher when compared to computers than it is in the foreign country. Why? Because I've got less workers and I need workers to make shoes. So shoes got more expensive in that country relative to the country where they got a whole bunch of workers making shoes. All right. So it's the factor endowments that accounts for initial pre-trade price differences. You got a lot of something. The stuff that uses that something to build stuff is cheap. Okay. Right. Okay. So you think about the capital, right? It's the price of capital. Like in the United States, the price of capital is effectively zero, right? The overnight market interest rate is, or overnight Fed funds rate target is zero, which makes like the 10-year Treasury rate still like below 3%. So if you have good credit, borrowing in the United States or utilizing capital, financial capital is basically free. You try doing that in a developing nation. It just ain't going to happen. Price of capital is way more expensive. Okay, save less of it. Right? We're awash in capital in the United States. We have too much financial capital. All right. So these two different slopes of the PPF, which are reflective of the different factor endowments, right, become the basis for trade. One thing's cheap in this place and it's expensive in that other place. The other, you got it, right? Okay. So if we were to draw out relative supply and relative demand for these two goods, computers and shoes, excuse me. Actually, it looks like we just did computers on here. That's fine because one implies the other, but let's just work through this. Okay, so this can be a little tricky to read. So, I'm going to buzz through this quickly because these videos are long, right? And they don't need to be super long because even if I go fast, you can just rewind and listen to me like 3 or 4 times and then work it out, right? And then go back and listen to it again and work it out, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to move pretty quickly to keep interest up. Okay, on the vertical axis we have PC to PS, right? So that's why we could express it in terms of shoes, right? We just flip everything. So as we move up the vertical axis, what that's saying is that the price of computers is rising relative to the price of shoes. So in absolute terms, right, the price of computers could be going down, right? But if shoes are going down more, then we're actually going up this axis. Okay, so put numbers to that. So put numbers to that, make that ratio higher, right, or lower. Just so you work through it, because I know people are thinking like, yeah, I get it right now. Well, you're gonna forget it before long unless you practice it. So practice it. Similarly, on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of computers, also expressed relative terms. Okay. All right. Again, practice it. So if we look at the willingness of the home country to export computers, so remember they're going to be, the graph on the last page showed they're the relatively low cost supplier. Computers are cheaper in the home country pre-trade than they are in the foreign country. Why? Because they've got more capital. And that's what we use to make computers. At what price, relative set of prices, is the home country willing to export computers? Well, any price above what they can sell them for at home. Okay, so let's say computer sells for $500 pre-trade. Well, that country is going to be willing to sell computers so long as the global price is at least $500. So $600, $700, they'll supply it for sure. So the autarky price, or the y-intercept of the home export function, is what? It's the pre-trade domestic price. Okay. And then why does it slope up from there? Well, diminishing returns. So take a look back over here. All right, so let's see, right? Okay, so look at that graph. Now take your finger, start at point A, and start moving it to the southeast along the PPF, indicating what? Indicating building more computers. What happens to that tangency? Tangency becomes steeper and steeper. In other words, the price of building computers is going up. Why? Because you're utilizing less and less effective factors of production as you scale up production. Okay, good. So the home export function slopes up. At what rate? At the rate that the slope of the PPF is increasing, right? So if the PPF is tapering off really quickly, that function's going to it's going to be real steep, that export function. All right. The import demand function is very similar. This is from the foreign country's perspective, right? So if you did it for shoes, right, everything just flips. It's all AIDs are the same. So at what price is the foreign country willing to import computers? Well, whatever their pre-trade price is. Let's say computers cost $800 in the foreign country, before all this happened. Well, as long as they can buy from the rest of the world at less than $800, they're going to buy them, right? Okay. Now, I'm going to slow down here for just a second because I want you to make a note. I'm using these nominal examples, $500, $800, because they're easy for you to grab onto. But you have to understand that all these models are in real terms. They're computers in terms of shoes, right? And so if we were to actually go out in the world and observe prices, we're going to be observing prices in two different currencies. At least. Right? We're not going to see bilateral trade that often. It's more, yeah. Okay, so please be aware that those sort of nominal excursions that I'm going on are not accurate reflections of what the model's saying. Because it could be the case that the nominal price in computers in the foreign country is actually lower in the home country, but when you take it relative to shoes, then it ends up being higher, right? So you've got to work it out the way it's done. Okay. So that foreign import function, which is demand for imports, right, slopes downward. Why? Because the same reason essentially that the export function slopes upward, right? So as we increase, if we decrease the relative price of computers to shoes, so let's say that, that at home, they can make computers for, again, I'm going to do it, right? Bad me. Don't use nominal examples, right? But, okay, say we can produce computers at $800, right? But I can buy them for $400 overseas. So that means the price on the global market is radically different than the pre-trade price in my home country. Well, that produces a large import demand. So in other words, we're gonna buy a lot of computers, right? Why? Because it's going to take a lot of movement around that PPF before those prices equalize across the two countries. Okay. All right, so when we get to the place where the two lines cross, just like everything in economics, it's where the magic happens, right? What do we get? We get a global trading price, right? So a global price for computers in terms of shoes. And we get a relative global production of computers relative to shoes. Okay? So now when I do this when we go in class this coming week, right? So when you're sitting in the classroom, I'm going to sketch this all out. And I'm actually going to sketch it out in a couple different ways rather than the single way that we're doing it here. So I encourage you to practice this, work through the stuff in your text, but also understand that I'm going to go through this in greater detail in our in-class meeting, right, to make sure that you get this. And I'm going to show you these trade effects actually in the PPF style graphs, right? So rather than just the supply and demand relationship. So I'll show you how to do that in class, show you what those results look like. All right, so moving forward. So we can see that there's room for gains for trade. Why is there room for gains for trade? Because there's different costs of production. Why are there different costs of production? There's different costs of production because there's different factor allocations. That's the HO story. Okay. So what happens to returns those factors? What happens to the return to capital or labor in the home country or in the foreign country? Does everybody just get equally happy, or is it more complicated than that? Well, of course, it's more complicated than that. So, pre-trade, right? Each nation, okay, so let's say you're the home country, which is capital abundant, right? Well, in that nation, the price of capital is going to be relatively low. Just like interest rates are relatively low in the United States because we have a lot of financial capital. Conversely, the price of labor in the United States is relatively high because it's relatively scarce, right? If I were to go a couple countries south, to say El Salvador, Nicaragua, capital is first of all, there's less labor too, right? There's way more people in the United States than in either of those countries or both of them combined. But relative to capital is much more scarce yet. So what we see in those relationships is that labor is relatively abundant in Central American countries, and the wages are relatively low. In other words, the thing that there's a lot of pre-trade, is paid relatively little, and the thing that's relatively scarce pre-trade is paid more, right? Now, it's not to suggest that scarcity alone connotes value, which it absolutely does not. But all things being equal, then that's a differentiating factor. All right. As trade opens in a Heckscher-Ohlin model, prices equalize, right? So because there's uniform tastes and preferences, and I'll show you that graphically in class next week. But it's certainly implied in everything we've said, right? So it's a law of one price, right? If I'm moving shoes from one place to the other, over time shoes become the same price in both places. And if I'm moving computers internationally, over time computers become the same price in both countries. All right. Well, what does that imply then about our factors of production? It's implied that over time, the factors of production prices will also equalize. In other words, so the country is producing shoes, right? Now there's a whole bunch more demand for labor's output. Labor's making shoes, right? They used to sell them locally. Now they get to sell them over the whole world. So there's a bunch of demand. So what happens is the price of labor in the foreign country starts to rise relative to capital. And what happens to the price of capital in the foreign country? It starts to fall relative to labor. And what about the price in the home country? Well, price in the home country, capital was abundant. That it was cheap before, and now people who own financial capital in the home country can provide that capital to the whole globe, and as a consequence, its price comes up. Conversely, the price of labor in the home country, which was relatively scarce before, now has to compete with foreign labor, and its price comes down. So the lesson of the Heckscher-Ohlin model with regards to factor returns is that the abundant factor benefits and the scarce factor loses. Okay, now the abundant factor gains more than the scarce factor loses. So for a capital-rich country like the United States, Heckscher-Ohlin model would predict that returns to capital with the opening of trade would increase, and the returns to labor, which is relatively scarce, would decrease. Okay, again, relative, right? So it doesn't mean that both couldn't go up, right? Wages could go up and the price of capital could go up, but capital will go up more. Okay. Conversely, in a nation that was relatively scarce in terms of capital and had a lot of labor, Heckscher-Ohlin model would predict that the wage rate is going to rise more than the capital rate, right? In fact, the capital rate may come down, right, in absolute terms, and the wage rate go up. Okay, so the abundant factor sort of wins in a Heckscher-Ohlin model, and the scarce factor doesn't win. But again, the winners, Ricardo still holds true. The winners win more than the losers lose. Okay, which implies, right, that you could redistribute, make everybody win, right? Absolutely. Okay, so here's what I was just talking about scarce and abundant factors. Oh, these pictures, by the way, are all obviously all from seaports, and they're all sort of historical pictures. Shipping and just ports themselves have today they're largely containerized, right? So everything goes into something that looks like the back of a semi truck, and then it gets loaded with really big cranes onto ships. But prior to containerized shipping, which is like the mid 1970s and before, this is more how a port looked, right? People loading stuff onto boats, and that stuff is in barrels and crates and sacks and so on and so forth. Really fascinating story, the containerization of shipping and how it affected sort of day-to-day existence within ports and just maritime shipping in general. So if you're looking for like an interesting econ nerd story, that's certainly one of them. All right. So as I said before, what I'm going to do in classes, I'm going to draw this out again for you. But I've deliberately made this lecture very quick, very fast moving, with the intent that you are stopping, working through this in your own notes, so writing your own notes out as we're going through this, and rewinding and viewing things that aren't immediately clear twice, thrice, or even more often than that. So we'll leave it there, and we'll see you soon. Take care.